Okay, today we're going to talk about rendering in this tutorial. So I have kind of a crude still life placed out here. This left over from one of the demos where I was showing presets and HDRI lighting. I quickly added a wood texture on kind of the table surface here, and so there'll be a texture on this file. So imagine that you have your still life kind of ready to go, and it's now time to think about rendering a final export. So the first thing I want to do here is in the perspective view, I find this resolution gate button to be really helpful. So it creates that line going around the side depending on which combination you have pressed here between these two buttons. But I think the first thing I want to do here is create a camera so that I can really think about staging this correctly. So I'm going to go to Create, Cameras, and then the first option, Camera. And then you'll see nothing changed. It's my perspective view still. You can see here if you zoom in, that little green, that tiny green object right there is my camera that kind of showed up in the scene. So what you'll want to do is you'll want to change your perspective view to the camera view to set it up. So go up to where my cursor is to Panels, Perspective, and then instead of Perspective, we're going to choose Camera. So it's right there. And so now you can see the view is the camera 1. And I'll just kind of position it out and kind of think about how I'm going to stage this scene here. Again, that resolution gate button is going to be really helpful here. And within the camera settings, you can see here we have the focal length. It's set at 35 right now. I'm going to set it to 75 because I kind of want this scene to kind of really focus in on just a few objects here. So keep in mind, just generally speaking, a focal length between 20 and 50 is typically a focal length you would use for a film. And then for a portrait photograph or something like that, you'll typically use a focal length of somewhere between 50 and 85. Just speaking purely from real life camera, perspective. So with that set up, I'm just going to I'm going to save my scene real quick. And then I'm going to go to Arnold and then do render just to do a test render, see how this is going. So right now my scene kind of looks like that. I put a black backdrop behind the scene here, and you can see I have a wood texture on the table here. And I like to just let that kind of render for a moment. And then I'm going to reposition the camera here to find the right angle that I want. So one thing that can be helpful here, and this can sometimes be a little buggy here, so don't be discouraged if it doesn't work for you. It's not crucial. But if you go to, in the Arnold render view, if you go to Window and 3D Manipulation, you see it kind of pops my view to the bottom corner there. It makes it so that you can change the camera position directly on the view there. Since on my computer it kind of does this thing where it snaps it to the small side, I don't find it super useful for my computer because there's some kind of glitch happening there, but for a lot of you that could be a really good way to help stage your scene. So I'm going to position it kind of the more traditional way here, and let's just say that's good here. If this was kind of a final project for me, I might want to focus more on getting the shadows right, kind of coming off of the glass there. But I mainly am concerned with showing you the rendering process here, so I'm not going to go in and get everything perfect here, but I do just want to kind of get this at least close to right. Okay. So this is, a little bit of a boring composition that I've come up with, but yeah, I just mainly want to show the render settings here. So that looks okay. And so what I want to do is, now that I'm settled on that, I'm going to lock the camera. And so you do that by just in the top left of your camera view, the second to the left, there's this lock camera icon. So I'll just press that, and now the camera can't be moved around. And so now we're ready to start thinking about exporting our rendered image out of Maya. And so the render out of this Arnold render view is, you can tell it's thinking about it, but there's still a lot of dots here, and we can get this looking better. So the way that I typically approach this is I like to go back to out of the Arnold render view and back to the render view that we used in project 1 here, which is, so I'm going to stop that and close that out and save my scene. And here we're going to eventually render this out using this button right here, which is the render button with the eye on it. And this is a good render view for kind of exporting out your final render here. So the first thing I want to do here is I'm going to just change this to, actually sRGB gamma should be okay here, so that'll be all right. So I'm going to change my render settings. So the render settings, again, is this button right here with the gear on it. We're using Arnold Render, that's great. I'm in the Common tab right now. Let's see here. This looks okay. I'm going to change my renderable camera to camera 1. I think that only matters when we're doing batch renders though. Let's see here. Under image size, this is the big one to change. Right now the image size is HD 540. So instead of that, I recommend either a 2K, 3K, or 4K square composition or HD 1080. With any of these presets, it's just changing the width and the height. And this is the pixel count right here. So you don't have to go by a preset here. You could do something that's 2500 by 1200 or something like that, and kind of dial in your own custom settings here. And you'll notice here I dialed in those custom settings and it was a narrower setting, so now you can see this is kind of getting cropped out a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something more like 2500 by 2000, and yeah, that looks okay. So that's kind of one of the main things we want to do, is just make sure that this is off of that HD 540 preset, which is really good for previewing but terrible for a final export, and just kind of bump that up to something that's more like in that range of the HD 1080, 2K, 4K, or something in this range. So now that that looks good, we're going to go over from the Common tab to the Arnold Renderer tab. And here, under sampling, you'll see these sliders here that by default will be 3 and then a bunch of 2s here. And so in the Arnold Renderer, this is kind of the quality of the render with these specific parameters. And you can kind of dial up the parameters one by one in Arnold. And so one thing to keep in mind is these sliders, as you move them up, it moves up exponentially. So what exponentially means is normally when something's not exponential, let's just say we have this diffuse slider and we move it from 2 to 3, it would move it just up just a little bit, in quality. But when something's exponential, that means that when you move it from 2 to 3, it squared it, it multiplies it. So the difference between the quality and when you drag from 2 to 3 is actually, quite a bit more. So we don't need to go too crazy with these sliders, is all that means. Is it starts off as 3, 2, 2, 2, and you really don't need to go too crazy with this. So this first one is the camera AA, that's anti-aliasing. I'm just going to move that up to 4. And depending on your scene, you'll want to move these sliders up differently. So again, camera anti-aliasing, that's just going to, just broadly speaking, move the quality of your render up, kind of knocking out any aliasing that might be happening. Diffuse refers to the base color, And so, for instance, that wood texture map that I put on there, that's a good example of where this slider will do some good for you. Pretty much no matter what, you're going to want the diffuse slider at least up to 3 on your projects. Specularity, there's specularity in this project, right? So on the glass and on the ball, there's this white uh, shining kind of reflection of the light. So specularity is in the scene. So I'll boost that up. The glass is transparent. So there's transmission. Transmission in Arnold just means transparency. So we want to boost that quality up. SSS stands for Subsurface Scattering, and so there isn't any subsurface scattering in the scene. That refers to if light enters into an object like a wax candle, and then it bounces around and then comes back out. And that's not happening in the scene. So another example of subsurface scattering is, imagine if you take a flashlight and then you shine it on your finger. You know how your finger might turn a little red as the light comes through it. That's an example of subsurface scattering there. So that's not happening in the scene, so we don't need to worry about it. Volume indirect, right here, refers to how many times a ray of light will bounce in your scene. And so right now it's set to 2. There's a few things going on here, and so actually I want the light to be able to kind of bounce around here within the scene. So just kind of imagining it here, I have the table in the background, at least 3, I might want that to be 4 eventually here. So from that point, this should be okay to render. And I'm just going to press File Save. And this is in the render view, this button here with the eye on it. And if you don't want to click this button because it'll just render out the perspective view. So you want to go to Render, Render, and Camera. And that'll get you where you need to go. And so it'll be the same process as before. Okay, so much later that render came out here. So with this in view, the first thing I'm going to do is just press this Keep Image button just to make sure that it saves in short-term memory here. You can see here that this render took a while. So let's see, the render time was 37 minutes. That's actually not really even that crazy here, especially for rendering still images out of Maya, because you want to kind of go for a high resolution to get all the detail in something that's hopefully portfolio ready. If you're kind of rendering for an animation, then that could, start to be a problem. But if you're kind of looking at a render like this, typically you can just kind of set the render before you, go to sleep or eat dinner or something like that. And then when you come back, it'll be ready for you here. So the first thing I want to do here is I'll just go to File, Save Image, and then on the project here, I would save it into source images. Actually, I'm sorry, save it into images. And I'll call this So one note here is during that render time where I cut away from the tutorial is at first I was working off of my external hard drive, which is a fast hard drive. It's an SSD hard drive right here. And so I was working off of that for my project, and it caused the render to go a lot slower and clunkier than it normally would have. So I kind of paused the render and just moved the whole project onto my desktop as we've been doing in the class here. And the render went much more smoothly here. It still took a while, but that's because I got pretty ambitious with my render settings there. So one thing that I like to do here, once this render is out, is I'll just open up Photoshop and locate the scene here. And just kind of make sure it looks okay in Photoshop. Yep, so that looks good. And you can kind of make any adjustments you want to make here. I like to use adjustment layers down here so that I work non-destructively. But let's see here. So you can just click on that little Ghostbusters button here. Levels and curves are both pretty helpful. So I'll just start with levels and take a look here. So you can see with the levels control, my adjustment layers there. And the controls for the levels are here. So it kind of popped up for me right there. It might pop up for you in a different place depending on how you have Photoshop set up. And so this is a graph. The darks are here, the mids are here, and then the highlights are here. And so that just helps give you an indicator of how things are kind of proportioned in terms of the brightness and contrast. We have the darks here. If I pull that slider, you can see how the darks get further accentuated. I don't really need to pump in the darks on this because this image is already a little bit on the dark side. So this mids and the lights, here I'll do the lights first here. So this, if I just increase it, boosts up the highlights of the scene a bit. And then this mid slider, if I drag it to the right, the mids get a little darker, and if I drag it to the right, the highlights get a bit darker. And so for me on this one, I just want to just drag the mids and the highlights a little bit to the left here to just kind of brighten up the image just a little bit. And you can always check with these adjustment layers just with this eyeball button to see what difference it's making. And so if you think this is a bit too much, you can go in here, just double click on the Ghostbusters button on the adjustment level thing there and just kind of continue to make adjustments here. You can also change the opacity of the adjustment layer and kind of blend it between that and the original image here, just to kind of find what you need here. My screen, there's kind of some light coming into my room right now, so it's a little hard for me to see the scene, but I think that looks okay. And, so you just might want to make any adjustments that you need to make here. Additionally, in Maya, I had made let me just backdrop behind the scene. But if you don't have a backdrop, you can also kind of render this out with an alpha channel, and then in Photoshop, composite whatever background that you want into the background there into Photoshop. And that's kind of a common technique, often referred to as matte painting in kind of the animation world here. So that's something that we can go over in the future here.